Okay, so we're carrying on looking at global migration. So we're now looking at the costs and benefits of global migration, which we've looked at a little bit in previous lessons, but in a bit more detail today. So this is where we are in terms of the specification. So we've had a bit of a look at the spatial patterns in terms of numbers and composition and direction of migrants in the previous lessons. We've had a look at things like migrant remittances and how much value they have. And today we're going on to these two bullet points down here. So how it can promote stability, growth, development, and how it can also lead to inequalities, conflicts, and injustices. It's always worth just noting the terminologies in the specification. This is the same sort of terminology that they'll use in the exam. So you could be asked about how global migration can lead to increased stability, or evaluate to what extent it can lead to increased stability. And then you might compare that to how much it could also lead to things like conflicts and injustice. Just before we do move on, I just want to kind of come back to these two terms because it's very important that we know the difference between interregional and intra-regional migration. Again, because this sort of terminology is what could be used in the exam, and if you get mixed up and you misunderstand what the question is asking you, then you could write a whole essay answer about interregional when you meant intra-regional. So inter is between places. Okay, and intra is within places. So examples of inter, as we looked at in previous lessons, is things like intergalactic travel, so traveling between galaxies. This is the sort of thing that happens in like science fiction films. Um, and then intra isn't a term that comes up terribly often. People don't tend to use the word intra very much. But a good example here is if at college we had a conflict between two classes, that would be an interclass conflict. And then if we had a conflict within the class, so people arguing and having disagreements within the classroom, then that would be an intra class conflict. So that would be within the classroom. So when we're talking about these regions, primarily we're looking at continents essentially. So we have the 7 continents. And so if someone is moving from somewhere in Africa to another place in Africa, that would be an intra-regional movement. But if someone moved from Africa, as has been quite common, into Europe, then that would be an inter-regional movement. We also learned about the division between forced migration, which is then refugees, so someone who's moving because they're in fear of being killed or persecuted. So that would be a refugee who's being forced to move. Essentially, all voluntary migration, which would include migrating to for a job, migrating to retire, migrating to be a student, they're all classed as economic migration. So whilst a student, you might think, well, they're not working, they're not making any money, they're making that choice based on economic reasons. So someone might move from one continent to another to go to a university because they think that that's going to improve their economic prospects in the future. So essentially, you're either an economic migrant or you're a refugee, and you're only a refugee if you're moving because of fear of death or persecution. Um, the one other example that I've sort of thrown out there, which is a bit of a trick question, is if someone went from, say, France to Germany for a week and then went back again, they're not a migrant at all. They're just a holiday maker. They're just going on holiday. So to be a migrant, you need to move for, well, to be a permanent migrant, you need to move for over a year. To be a short-term migrant, you could move for, say, 3 months or more and go from there. Okay, so that's just to clarify that terminology. It's really important that we have that clear. So today, looking at the positives and negatives of migration, and some of this is looked at through some of the terminology that's used when we talk about globalization. So globalization isn't specifically a big part of this course, but it does come up within topics. So what we have here are all factors of globalization. So as the world globalizes, it means that people and countries and companies all become much more interconnected. And that happens because the flows and movements of people, money, ideas, and technology have all increased in speed and ease and cheapness. So if you think back to the start of the last century, so the 1900s, to travel from, say, the UK to Australia would involve traveling by boat, and it would take weeks, and it would be very expensive, and it was the sort of thing that people did exclusively, pretty much as a permanent move. They didn't kind of go on holidays and then come back. And then through the last century, we've had various iterations of air travel, and people have been able to move quickly and increasingly cheaper, to the point now where most people could consider at some point going on a holiday abroad, and even a lot of people could consider going on a sort of once in a lifetime holiday to, say, Australia or somewhere, and that would actually be something they could afford to do. Not only can people move easily, but we can send money really easily, and that's very significant in terms of, say, reducing intervening obstacles. So if one part of a family moved to the UK from somewhere in Europe, that part of the family could earn some money, and then they could transfer that money home, and that would help the rest of the family move. And if you imagine going back even 50 years or 60 years, that would be a lot harder. That wouldn't be nearly as easy for people to transfer money um, through the internet and the sorts of ways that we have now to sort of securely move money without problem. And that's also something that encourages people to migrate. So someone who migrates to America from Mexico can then send money home regularly and help the family at home, whereas more historically that it wouldn't be as easy to send the money, so it would be less appealing to make that move. Okay, so this map here on the right shows the 10 biggest flows of money, the remittances of money that migrants send. So to draw your attention to the biggest one here is $22.2 billion being sent from the United States to Mexico. We've also got a huge amount of money being sent from the United States to China, India, and the Philippines. And this is part of why there's sometimes quite negative ideas about migrants in America, the idea that people are essentially earning money in America and then they're sending it home. So therefore they're not spending that money within the country. They're not buying goods and services within the country that's then helping to support the economy of that country. Another big remittance that's quite easy to miss because it's a small arrow is down here in the Hong Kong to China area. That's 13.5 billion. So that relates to the sort of politics of that area, that Hong Kong is a part of China, but also has a lot of separation from China. So China is communist, and that affects the way that it can make money, whereas Hong Kong operates in a much more capitalist way. So there's a major financial center in Hong Kong. And so lots of people might move to Hong Kong to make lots of money, and then they send that money back to family in China. And you may have seen in the news, there's been a lot of protests and issues in Hong Kong over the last few years because China is trying to gain more control of the area. And people in Hong Kong are very determined to continue to be democratic, and they don't want that control to be taken away. And so there's a lot of conflict there about that. And sort of China doesn't want to lose the money that Hong Kong's making, but it does want to have more control over it. Okay, so the main thing with flows of money is remittances. These have lots of benefits compared to, say, aid that is sent from one country to another. So sometimes the United States, for example, might send aid to somewhere like India to support their development, to help them grow. But that aid is completely at the discretion of the people in charge, of politicians. So at the moment, that would be Donald Trump. He would be deciding how much money was being sent and to which countries, and what that money could be used for. So there would be conditions on that money, and that money may also, like I say, come with political conditions, meaning that it's not uncommon that, say, the UK might give aid, but then there'll be an expectation of us being able to base military personnel in that country or something along those lines. Whereas remittances, which are sent from one family member to another, those don't have any strings attached to them of that type. They're very reliable. They're quite fairly sent, in the sense that lots of people get a small amount of money, rather than big companies, for example, getting a lot of money to help them grow. The argument against remittances is that one, they can be used for illegal activity. So things like people could move to a wealthy country, make money, and send it home to fund things like terrorism, or to fund one side of a conflict in another country. But the other problem is a bit of a deeper one. So if you imagine people in an impoverished country, so we would say one of the poorer countries in Africa, and some people there want to send family members to Europe to make money. The only people in that area who are going to have the money to afford to send their family through smuggling routes or to get a fake passport and fly them into the area are going to be the wealthy people who live in that region. So the most impoverished people in that country aren't going to be able to afford to do that. They're not going to have the money available. So you've got the sort of wealthiest people in the region sending family members to try and make their fortune abroad. And then those same families are the ones who are receiving the remittances and becoming even wealthier. So it is quite possible that remittances can actually exacerbate and make worse the inequalities within a region. And the same is true as development occurs in general. So, as say, for example, in India, where lots of clothes are being manufactured, it's the wealthy people in the towns and the villages in India who are the ones who become the kind of factory managers, the owners of factories and things. So again, it exacerbates and increases the difference between the rich and the poor within the developing countries. So it's not all good, remittances. They have a lot of benefits, but it's not. We can be quite evaluative about them. So, flow of ideas. We looked at this the other week that we've got social remittances. So, concepts being sent from Western countries to developing countries. And this is part of what led to the Arab Spring a number of years ago. So, that was where a lot of countries like Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, they rose up against dictators. So Colonel Gaddafi was killed at this point, and the country was sort of taken over by a more left-wing democratic sort of attitude. So this can be to do with things like democracy, people feeling that they should be able to vote on their leaders and have control. It can be all kinds of things like women's rights and access to education and marriage and things like this, and things that we in a developing country in the West think of as important and often think of as right. And we're kind of these ideas are being sent back to other places. Now, there's a question as to how correct this is. Now, obviously, certain things such as women's rights, I think we can agree are sort of a universal good, and there's not really a valid argument against equality between people. But there are other things that maybe are socially being remitted that don't necessarily have to be right or wrong. So certain ways of running a country or certain beliefs or certain behaviors. People are complaining that developing countries are becoming heavily westernized, and that's not necessarily always a good thing. So it's the arguments like countries might be losing some of their identity through this remittance of ideas. So there's good and bad, and again, it's a really good opportunity to be evaluative and to discuss sort of both sides. So the idea that, if you go to a traditional market in Turkey, do you really want to see like a McDonald's along the side of it? Possibly not, but then maybe the people in Turkey, have seen that sort of thing, and that's the kind of thing they do want. It's not uncommon that people here in Norfolk are desperately keen for a McDonald's to open in their local area. So, and then finally, flow of technology. I think this is a bit less important, but technology has been really useful for keeping track of migration. So NGOs, non-governmental organisations, so essentially charities, have been able to use mobile phones to direct aid much more effectively, so they can identify where people in need are. And there's an example here of Pakistan using digital data to identify internally displaced people in urban areas. So an internally displaced person is essentially a refugee who hasn't yet crossed a border. So you're only a refugee if you seek refuge in a foreign country. And in Pakistan, in this example, we've got people who have left the area that they're from, but they haven't yet crossed the border, so they are internally displaced. So technology and the flow of technology, meaning that people in developing countries are getting mobile phones and things, is really helpful for being able to help and respond to migrant crises. Okay, so there is information about the ability of migration to lead to increased stability, economic growth and development on page 222. So there's a table at the bottom, so you need to make some notes on that. So if you want to pause now and take those notes, and then we will move on. Okay, so now we're on to the negatives that global migration can bring. So inequality, conflict, and injustice. So here on the right, this is known as the jungle in Calais. So this is where migrants end up being housed and staying after travelling across Europe in the hope of getting to the UK to seek asylum. So the argument here is that this is not a sanitary or a healthy place for people to be housed. And there's been issues recently with things like the coronavirus, that there's been all kinds of issues in camps of large numbers of people contracting coronavirus because they're not being sort of well looked after, well cared for. You can imagine in this picture, multiple people sleeping in these blue tents. It's going to be impossible to practice social distancing and things like this. So migrants can end up in these places, and there's examples of human rights violations happening in some of these. So Myanmar and Thailand are in Southeast Asia, and there was a lot of issues in Myanmar in terms of human rights violations against the Rohingya Muslims, and so people were fleeing as refugees to Thailand, and they've been kept in camps on the border, and in those camps is where people have experienced human rights violations. So they're not being treated well, they're not being treated fairly, and it's quite hard for the global community to monitor these things. So it's not necessarily that easy for reporters and journalists to enter these places and report on what's going on, and so people aren't necessarily that aware of what's happening. So we also end up with inequalities due to sort of unequal flows of people and money and ideas. So what we generally see is people moving to ACs, advanced countries, and then money being sent from these ACs back to the developing countries. And this creates all kinds of issues in terms of it's often the best and the brightest people who are leaving the developing country, and the most determined and the most hardworking, say, who are migrating, who have the most determination and what have you. And so it creates what's called brain drain in the country that they're leaving. So all the sort of best people have moved away, leaving behind sort of the less able, if you like. So, for example, our NHS is heavily reliant on doctors migrating from other countries to the NHS. We don't necessarily train enough doctors and nurses in this country to meet our need in the NHS. So we're therefore basically welcoming and taking doctors from other countries, and those doctors are no longer in their country of origin. So again, we've got some notes to take. There's a table at the top of page 223 on these different headings: inequalities, conflicts, and injustices. So we want to know about how migration can lead to these different things, okay? So we've got some review questions, so I'll just put all these up, and then you can pause and have a go at them, and then I'll just go through them, okay? So if you pause now, have a go at these questions. Okay, so UN definition of an international migrant is someone who moves for over a year. Okay, so as soon as you've moved for more than a year, then you are now an international migrant. Net migration means sort of in minus out equals net. So you take the people who've come in, you minus off the people who've come out, and you get your net migration. So that can either be a positive or a negative figure, depending on if you've got a net in migration or a net out migration. Okay, intervening obstacles. So to understand intervening obstacles, we also need to cover the idea of push and pull factors. So push factors are things that make you want to leave the country that you're in, and pull factors are things that make you want to move to the country that you're moving to. And the intervening obstacles are neither of those, but they're the things that make moving harder. So for example, say for instance, I wanted to move to Australia. It might be that there's more jobs available in Australia, and I prefer the weather, for example. And it might be that there's reasons I want to leave the country that I'm in. Maybe there's conflict of some kind. So we've got the push and the pull factors. I know I want to move, but it might be that there are certain visa restrictions, which would be an intervening obstacle. It might be that I can't afford to move. I haven't got the money to afford a flight, so that would be an intervening obstacle. So it's not to do necessarily with what my desires are about moving. It's not about whether or not I actually want to make the move. It's about what's standing in my way. So specific reasons for intra-regional migration following 2004. So this relates to more countries being included within the free movement of the EU region. So we had quite a few countries join from largely Eastern Europe, and so that then led to a major movement of people within the EU. So migrant remittances are generally considered, this is normally money being sent home, but we also talked about social remittances, and these are really important in terms of development. They provide money and ideas and skills to developing countries and help them to grow. And how can international migration lead to increased socioeconomic inequalities? So that's what we were just looking at. So that's issues to do with things like brain drain, so people leaving a country and taking the sort of best and brightest and fittest members of the workforce. And it can also, as I mentioned, we have issues around remittances not being equally spread amongst the population, but being sent to the family members of those who've migrated, and that can also create a lot of inequality. So, just to finish this all off, we've got this task that I want you to do. So, in your opinion, does migration bring more positives than negatives? So, what I want you to do is basically take what we've done today and in previous lessons and put it into sort of peel paragraph structures using examples and figures and things like this. Okay, so you can imagine the sort of question you would get. So, to what extent do you agree that migration is an entirely positive process, something like that, and your discussing and evaluating whether that is true. So something to consider to sort of help you, this final bullet point, is to answer fully, you may consider that migration may benefit or harm certain people and certain countries more than others. So that can be the real crux of your evaluation. You might say that some people in the origin country really benefit from migrant remittances, but it does create inequalities as not everyone gets them equally, and things like this. Okay, so this is what will help you to be evaluative. And this is the really important challenge step that you need to take to ensure that you're ready for the exam, that you know what you're doing. Okay.